All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsor for the month of Shvat, Mrs. Selma Woolf, for dedicating all the Shiurim drushos this month. With immense gratitude for the refuos from Hashem, in the merit of refuah for all of those in need, in the zchus of our brave soldiers, and in the zchus and Meir Hashem of the return of our hostages. Our week of learning sponsors, Saeed and Sima, Haken, in memory of Saeed's mother, Taji, Behtari, Bas, Harav, Meir, Moshe, and of course we dedicate all of Maseches Bava Le'ilu Nishmas, Master Sergeant Eliyahu, Harush, Hashem Yikom Damo, in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, may his Neshama have an aliya and the family in Neshama. And also with that, let us begin. We have a really incredible, yesterday's daf was incredible, today's daf is incredible, really incredible daf out of us today. So today's daf is Pei Aleph 81, and we are picking up on Pei Amud Beis 80b. We left off Halokeach Bayis Be'eretz Yisrael, 6 lines up from the bottom. So the Gemara said as follows. Okay, one of the items listed in the Brayso so it's Halokeach Bayis Be'eretz Yisrael. If a person purchases a home in Eretz Yisrael, Kosvin Alov Ono Vavilu B'Shabbos. You're allowed to write, an Ono is a document of sale. You're allowed to write the document of sale even on Shabbos itself. So the Gemara says, "B'Shabbos, that's not really. You're allowed to go ahead and write a document on Shabbos. Ksiva, writing is one of the 39 malachas. As important as it is to purchase home in Eretz Yisrael, purchase land in Eretz Yisrael, you're allowed to do this on Shabbos." To which the Gemara says, "Elikid da'amar Rava Hasam, Omer lenachri va'oseh, Haken Omer lenachri va'oseh." None of us say it doesn't mean that literally a person is permitted to write the document himself. Rather, one is permitted to instruct a non-Jew to write the document on his behalf. That even though, again, normally we say, "Ba'avagav da'amir lenachri shvosi, mishum yishav Eretz Yisrael lo gazru be'rabbanan." Now remember, again, we've spoken about this many times. Amir lenachri, instructing a non-Jew to perform malacha, is what we call a shvus. A shvus means an isser d'rabbanan. But again, there are certain circumstances where the Rabbanah, where Chazal lifted this particular restriction and allowed you to go ahead and instruct the non-Jew to do malacha on your behalf. So there are a number of different examples of this. In halacha, apparently one of the examples is Yishav Eretz Yisrael. For the purpose of settling Eretz Yisrael, for the purposes of purchasing property, Jewish property in Eretz Yisrael, you are allowed to go ahead and instruct a non-Jew to write up the document for you even on Shabbos. Incredible. So the Gemara says, obviously, I, the Jew, I can't write it myself. Remember, again, Chil Shabbos is permitted, but only for the sake of pikuach nefesh, only for the sake of saving a life or suffik pikuach nefesh. As important as it is to purchase land in Eretz Yisrael, you can't write up the document yourself, but you absolutely can instruct a non-Jew to do so on your behalf. Incredible. Am Yisroel Nachmani, Am Yisroel. Halokeach ir Eretz Yisrael. Similarly, if a person purchases a city in Eretz Yisrael. So again, why settle on a house when you could own a city, right? Or why settle on something you could own a city? So a person purchases a city in Eretz Yisrael. Kolfin also likach lo derech me'aber ruchosel yishum yishav Eretz Yisrael. This is very important. We force the owner to make sure, literally to purchase, we force him to make sure that there is a pathway leading into the city from all 4 directions. Now, what's the pshat? So halacha has a vested interest in Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, in ensuring that Jews are able to, should they choose, to live in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, if you buy a city, you want to make sure that city is accessible from every direction. So therefore, halacha l'maaseh, if you purchase a city, you also have to make sure that it has access from every direction. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says as follows. TORAH, we'll say an incredible Gemara over here. Asara Tana in Hisna Yoshua. So we'll say when Yoshua, remember again, so a little bit of quick Jewish history. Moshe Rabbeinu wanted more than anything to be able to enter into Eretz Yisrael, but he was denied entry. So his Talmud, Yoshua, takes the reins of Klal Yisrael, and leads the Jewish people into Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara now talks about the 10 enactments that Yoshua made for the Jews entering into Eretz Yisrael. So these are like the 10 conditions, the 10 tinaim that have to work for Eretz Yisrael. So now listen to this. Number 1, top of the we'll say 81a. Number 1, Shumarim b'charshin. Number one is that everyone has the right to go ahead and graze their animals in the forest. Now, I will say, now remember, so don't confuse this with yesterday's daf. In yesterday's daf, we were speaking about the concept that you're not allowed to raise a behemoth daka. Right? The only exception is if you're able to go ahead and graze it in forest land. Now, forest land that the Gemara was talking about yesterday was really like public land. Right? Here, this is something different. Here, the Gemara is suggesting that Yoshua said that everyone has the right to graze their flocks on forest lands, even if those lands technically belong to someone. Look at Rashi. Shumarin, behemos becharshin, v'shelo yakbid bal hayar al kach. So enactment number one, everyone has access to forests. Next, umalaktin eitzim b'sadosehem. Ultimately, again, I will say you could go into someone else's field, and you could go ahead and collect literally again eitzim. Eitzim are pieces of wood. Collect pieces of wood. Umalaktim asavim b'chomakom. Similarly, again, you can collect grass. Again, for animal feed. Ultimately, again, in any place. Chutz mitilson. The exception, of course, is in a field of fenugreek. Again, we'll discuss that. So I will say, you're going to see the common denominator amongst these themes amongst these enactments is the following: that as much as Eretz Yisrael is split up tribally, right? Every shevet has its own nachal, has its own portion. Yoshua was conveying to Klal Yisrael that Eretz Yisrael belongs to Klal Yisrael, and as such, there's a certain type of what we'll call it, interwoven or interconnected usage that all of the tribes have in all of the areas. And what this does is, I will say, it creates a sense of achdos. It creates a sense of unity. So you have this idea that, everybody is permitted to use forest. But one second, but the forest is going to be owned by someone specific. Yet with all of that, everyone has rights to the forest. Everyone has rights to small pieces of wood. Eitzim, again, we're going to define the scope of each of these things. Everyone has rights to go out and collect grass for the sake of grazing their animals. Except a field of fenugreek. We'll see why. So we'll say all of this paints this picture that Eretz Yisrael belongs to all of us. Belongs to all of us. Even though it's split up tribally, every Yid has a chelik in every single part of Eretz Yisrael. And what Yoshua's purpose was, his purpose was ultimately, again, to create that sense of achdos, that sense of cohesion within the people. Next. V'kol min netios b'chol makom. So we'll say, so again, we're going to explain a lot of these in the Gemara. So kol min netios, Rashi says over here, mina ilan kodem bad lital. You could snip off small branches from a tree. So we'll say the way, in other words, if I want to plant an apple tree, I can get an apple sapling, or I can snip a branch from another apple tree, and I can plant that. So you're allowed to go ahead and take a branch from an existing tree to be able to go ahead and plant it in your own yard. Okay, now both say, now remember, this is someone else's tree. Right? This tree belongs to someone, but I'm allowed to go and snip off a branch of it. Okay? The Gemara says, Chutz migrofios shal zayis. The exception, of course, becomes with the branches of an olive tree. We're going to see about say, you could take from an olive tree, but the whole chap with an olive tree is you're going to have to make sure that you leave behind a much more significant part of the growth. Again, we'll talk about all of this in just a little bit. We'll say if a new well, a new spring, ultimately again is discovered, everyone has rights in it. Everyone has rights. So Reuven's digging on his property. There's a new spring. Everyone has rights to draw water. Now I will say, what Rashi points out to her is something very interesting. Look at Rashi. Behtari mechadash v'choshkin ma'yonos yishanim shemos Yoshua. So I will say, springs that were there when Klal Yisrael entered into Eretz Yisrael under the leadership of Yoshua, those everyone enjoys the rights to. The chiddush over here is that even if someone literally digs a new well, ultimately everyone has the right to go ahead and utilize it. Haken biyama shel Tiveria. Everyone is allowed to fish in Tiveria. Specifically, this is the Kinneret. Everyone is permitted to go ahead and fish in the Kinneret. Yifros kela v'yamid es hasfina. So what this is referencing over here is actually interesting, is underwater traps. So the one thing you can't do is saying you could use nets. We'll talk about this actually. Really, what it's talking about over here is fishing, like with a fishing rod. Everyone is allowed to fish in the Kinneret. What you have to avoid is the use of underwater nets. Why? Because that impedes boat traffic. So everyone has the right to fish, but again, not everyone has the right to use the underwater nets. And again, if a person is traveling and they need to relieve themselves, you could go into someone's yard, right? You go into someone's yard behind their wall, and you could defecate, even if it's a field of karkum. Karkum is coriander. Again, we'll discuss what exactly this means. So this is actually a very interesting case. You're allowed to walk across people's fields. Now, the lashon of literally you're allowed to walk along shvilei rishus. Shvilei rishus means the pathways for which you have permission. But I will say, I look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, "If you're mahalchin b'shvilei harishus, stam b'nei adam mishech nisu tivu asam ad shas hazriya mafkirin sadosem likanis bahem kol adam lekatzar sadarach shelo yakif vehin nikraim shvilei harishus." Now, this is very interesting. Rashi points out over here, essentially, after the harvest season, so now you've harvested everything, right? You've brought everything in from the field. There's an amount of time between the harvest and the planting. So generally, people don't care if you walk on their field during that time, right? Why don't they care? Nothing's happening in the field anyway. So Yoshua kind of instituted it was almost like an institutionalized not caring. Right? That again, people should be able to use your field as a shortcut. Again, they're not adversely impacting you because it's after everything has been brought in, after everything's been harvested and brought into the silos, nothing new has been planted. So all it is just a fallow field. So ultimately, Yoshua instituted that people should be able to use your property as a shortcut. Until when? Until the second rain. Rashi points out over here, this is on the 17th of Mar Cheshvan, because at that point in on, things begin to grow in the field. Okay. Literally translated, you're allowed to go ahead and walk on the sides of Rosh Hashanah, which really and essentially enters into people's private property because of the pegs in the road. Now, also, it's actually very interesting as well. Rashi points out over here, what is this? Rashi points out like this: during rainy season, people would be traversing the Rosh Hashanah, and it's all muddy, right? So because it's all muddy, what ends up happening is after the rainy season is over, and now the summer comes, and the sun dries out the Rosh Hashanah, essentially there are potholes. The Gemara calls it pegs because essentially, again, the raised areas in between the depressions would be like pegs. It was difficult to walk until, again, at a certain point, I guess everything once again got leveled out when there was enough pedestrian traffic, but it was difficult to walk. So sometimes what people would do is they would walk, instead of walking in the primary Shirabim, they would walk on the sides of the road. The problem is, what's the size of the Shirabim? That's people's property. So Yoshua instituted that the public has the right to kind of walk on the periphery of private property until the Rosh Hashanah gets straightened out a little bit. Okay? V'hatoa ben akramim. What's the interesting case? Let's say someone gets lost in a vineyard. So what's the halacha? Mafsig v'ola, mafsig v'yored. You're allowed to cut through the vines until you go ahead and you find where you are. So in other words, we'll say, I'm getting lost in Ruvain's vineyard. I'm lost. I don't know where I am. So now, again, I'm allowed to cut through the vines until I'm able to figure out where I am. Now, obviously, goes without saying, you have to pay for what you damaged, right? In that case over here. Because here, you're damaging someone's property, but the halacha gives you the license to damage to kind of figure out where exactly you are. Incredible. Umeis mitzvah kona makomo. And a meis mitzvah, right? We'll say, remember again, a meis mitzvah is someone who's died and there is no one to attend to him. So the halacha is you're allowed to bury him. Kona makomo means literally he acquires the space upon which he's lying. So the idea is whereas a normal corpse, you take it, you collect it, you bury it somewhere specific. A meis mitzvah is buried literally right where he dies, and he acquires that space. Okay. Shabbos say, it's really incredible. These are the 10 enactments. The 10 enactments that Yoshua enacted when Klal Yisrael came into Eretz Yisrael. We're going to see, in fact, really the list really seems to be more like 11 than 10, but we'll talk about that in the bottom of 11 days. Says the Gemara, we'll say now let's go through them. Shumarin b'charshin. So remember again, number 1 was that everyone has the right to graze their animals in the forests. Right? And at the end of the day, the owner of the forest doesn't have the right to stop anyone from grazing. So remember, Amar Papa, lo Amar Ela Daka Begasa. We're only talking about the Moshe where what? Where people are grazing small animals in a large forest. Aval Daka Bedaka, but small animals in a small forest, or Gasa Begasa, or large animals in a large forest, low. The Choshekain, and you're not allowed to do, and all the more so, Gasa Bedaka Dolo, large animals in a small forest, you also can't do. So we're saying we're just qualifying it, that we're talking about a case of where you're grazing small animals in a very large forest. So therefore, again, the owner of the forest is not going to be impacted. So in that kind of case, in other words, what we're just saying, and this is intuitive, when Yoshua said that everyone is allowed to use forests to graze their animals, that obviously is talking about in a situation where allowing people to graze is not going to chas v'shalom negatively impact anyone. But if it's going to negatively impact someone, then Allah Chalamai says it's not going to be permitted. Incredible. Let's go back. You're allowed to collect, literally again, branches of wood. So now I want to go, Reuven has an apple tree, I want to go ahead and plant my own apple tree. I could walk into Reuven's field and I can go ahead and snip off a branch from his apple tree and plant it in my yard. So the Gemara says, Lo amar ela behizmi vihigi. So I'll say this is only talking about really hizmi vihigi literally means like small bushes and dried out branches. Aval b'shar eitzim lo. But obviously again other eitzim not allowed to do. Vafilu behizmi vihigi lo amar ela b'mechubarin. This is only talking about branches ultimately again that are attached. Aval, the Telushin law, but I will say detached branches, ultimately, again, you're not allowed to. What's the logic? Because if it's detached, the assumption is the owner himself cut them, and if he took the time to cut them, then the pashtas, that means he wants them. Even with attached branches, lo amran ela belach, he only said it with moist branches. Aval bi'aveshim lo, and ultimately, again, not with dried branches. Ubilvad shelo yashrish. Now, obviously, also, whatever you're cutting, the goal of the Abbas, just the imagery of it and the logic of it is, Yoshua instituted that I could come in, essentially, cut something off of someone else's tree, as long as it does not negatively impact his tree. So therefore, the idea of Shelo Yashrish means you can't uproot whatever someone else planted. So you could snip off a little bit this, right? Attached, not detached, moist, not dry. All these different qualifications. The idea being that I could take something as long as it doesn't negatively impact Ruvain. You could collect grass. You could collect grass from any place except from a field of fenugreek. Now, we'll say, B'Pashtos, what that sounds like is like this. I could go to any field, collect some grass, but in a field of fenugreek, apparently, again, the fenugreek plant requires grass in order to grow. So I can't collect grass from that field as that will negatively impact the fenugreek. Says the Gemara, the Memra, the Tilson Ma'alula Asavim. Is that to say that grass is good for fenugreek? Or mini Areza Kasha Tilson Sha'alsa im Mini Asavim Ein Mechayvin Osolakar. So let's listen to this. Yeah, we learned in the Raisa that if you have in a field grass growing together with fenugreek, so the Gemara seems to feel that this is a problem of kilayim. This is a problem of forbidden mixtures. The Gemara says, don't worry, you don't have to mandate upon the owner to uproot the grass. Why? The Gemara says because a person is going to end up doing it anyway. Why are they going to end up doing it anyway? Because the presence of the grass is harmful to the fenugreek. So you see from here that grass is not good for fenugreek. Grass is harmful. So what's going on? Rabbi Yirmiyah Lokashya Kan Lazera kan lezirin. We'll say everything depends ultimately again as to why you're growing the fenugreek. Are you growing the fenugreek ultimately again because you want to use the fenugreek itself, or you're actually growing the fenugreek for the fenugreek seeds, for the seeds? So apparently the Gemara says like this: Lezera kashile. So apparently fenugreek being grown for seed, the presence of grass is harmful. So the Gemara says, Afsavim mechashile, lezirin malila. But apparently if you're growing the fenugreek to use the fenugreek itself, the presence of grass is beneficial. Why? The chikaimi b'nei asavin mirkiva. It's actually very beautiful because again, when you're growing the fenugreek for the fenugreek itself, the presence of grass is beneficial. Why? Because as the fenugreek grows, it has the ability to lean on the grass. So the grass supports the growth of the fenugreek. Jabot says an incredible, such a beautiful imagery. Sometimes again in life, if you want to grow as an entity, if you want to grow as an individual, if you want to grow as a stalk of fenugreek, you need grass to lean on. Nothing in this world could grow unsupported. Everything to grow for seed, where you don't need the growth itself. All you need is the growth inside of the seed that could grow, or the growth inside of the plant that could grow unsupported. But if you want, at the end of the day, to be able to use the fenugreek itself, the presence of grass is so beneficial because it's something to kind of help support the weight of the fenugreek. You want personalistic growth in life, you have to make sure that you have someone or something that you could actively lean on. Incredible. Another possibility is kan la'adam, kan la'behema. One is talking about fenugreek that's used for human consumption, and one is animal consumption, to which the Gemara says, so apparently again, so the Gemara, good. Kan la'adam, kan la'behema. The chayva de la'behema hava, desara, I'm sorry, the chayva de la'behema hu desara, asavim nami miboyle. So apparently, again, on both sides, if the fenugreek is being used for animal feed, so the presence of grass is beneficial because the animal will eat the fenugreek and the grass. For human consumption, ultimately the presence of grass is detrimental. All right, uminaya dinan. So I'll say in general, when looking at a field of fenugreek, how do you know, just out of curiosity, if it's planted for people or if it's planted for animals? How would you know? So the Gemara says, Amra Papa, Share Mishare la'adam, Lo Share Mishare lebehema. If it's planted in rows, right, then ultimately that's indicative that it's planted for people. If it's not planted in rows, then that's indicative that it's planted for animals. Look at Rashi, Mishare asuyim ka'arugos. If it's literally planted arugos, right, in rows, then that's indicative that it's for people. Not in rows, then it's going to be planted ultimately again for animals. But it's also really a fascinating yisod as well. That rows, right, what do rows represent? Rows represent a seder, in order. Right? You know, one of the greatest distinctions between people and animals is that animals are governed by instinct. Instinct drives you wherever it is, right? In other words, an animal just simply reacts to whatever stimuli are around it, and there's no seder. What makes a person? A seder, an order, right? I have a plan, right? Today I'm going to accomplish A, B, and C. Today, here is the goal for today. So you look at a field, how do you know if the field was planted for a person or for an animal? If it's an animal, it's haphazard. And if it's a person, there's a seder. What makes Adam, and not Behema is a Seder. And Rabbi said this is so important because all too often we go through life, unfortunately, in this regard, like animals, right? Without a plan, without a direction. And so I kind of end up wherever the wind blows or whatever happens that particular day, that's kind of what shapes the results of my life. But as an Adam, I'm supposed to live an Aruga life. As an Adam, I'm supposed to live a row life. In other words, there's a Seder. What's the goal? What's the plan? What's the direction? Who do I want to be? What do I want to accomplish? What's the destination? What's the finish line? What am I aiming towards? And lav dafka that a person has to answer these questions, for the rest of their lives. But again, at least to answer it for today. For today. Who do I want to be? Where do I want to get to? What is my role? What is my aruga for today's unit of existence? Incredible Yisod. V'kot min netiyah b'chol makom, chutz migrofios shel zayis. And it will say in general, you're allowed to go ahead. So this is supposed to say, so whereas before we're talking about like branches that you're allowed to take, right? That's malaktim eitzim yisrael the same. You're allowed to take branches. Here, kot min netiyah b'chol makom. Here we'll say, literally again, I could take like a piece of a sapling, right? I take a piece of a tree. That's kot min netiyah b'chol makom. Chutz migrufio shel zayis, with the exceptions of an olive tree, shoots from an olive tree. So perish Rabbi Tamchum v'Rebbe Barios mishum zakin echad b'zayis b'kebesa b'kanim b'gefanim mina pekak u'lemala. Supposed to listen to this. Now, with the zayis, with an olive tree, the halacha is you have to go ahead and leave. In other words, when taking something from an olive tree, you can't obviously take from the olive tree and leave it flush to the ground. You have to leave at least a kabesa. You have to leave at least like literally again an egg's volume worth of the actual trunk intact. Of course, you have to leave more than that. But bekanim ubegefanim mina pekaku lamala. Ultimately, again with reeds, right, and with vines from the knot. But as well say, if you ever look like at a vine or at reeds, they have like knots along the. You have to leave from the knot and above. Ushar kali lanos min ovo shel ilan v'lo min chudo shel ilan. And with all other trees, ultimately again, you could take me'evo shel ilan. Rashi says. Ultimately, again, you're allowed to take, let's say, from the thinner branches, but ultimately, again, not from the thicker branches. Similarly, again, you could take from newer branches that did not yet yield fruit, but you can't take from older branches which are already established that they go out and they eat fruit. Similarly, again, you can take from the tree, from the part of the tree that is not exposed to the sun on the base, but you can't take from the part of the tree that is exposed to the sun. So the common denominator in all of these things is you're allowed to go ahead, the bottom line is you're allowed to go ahead and take from the tree of your fellow in order to take a branch that you could replant in your own rishos. What are the caveats? The caveats are, obviously, you can't take in a way that is going to impede the growth of your fellow's tree. You also can't go ahead and take from the stronger part of the tree, which is why, again, you can't take from the part that's in the sun. You can only take from the part that's not in the sun. And lastly, you can't take from any part of the tree that is already actively producing fruit, only from parts that don't produce fruit. Okay, incredible. We'll say, if you think about all of these things also, it's very, there's a very, if you think about it, it sounds totally counterintuitive, right? That I could go ahead and walk into someone's domain and take some piece of his tree for myself. I don't have to pay for it. I don't have to ask. I'm just allowed to take it. I will say it helps to highlight also, besides the achdus and besides the fact that Eretz Yisrael belongs to all of us, what it also helps to highlight is a good din, is a good reminder in Parnasa. So sometimes we see someone else who is successful, and understandably so, we're jealous. We're jealous, especially if it happens to be someone who is in a similar industry to you, right? So someone who does something that has nothing to do with me, I'm not really jealous. I might be jealous of their wealth, but I'm not jealous of their success per se. So if you think about it, the way we believe is your success does not come at my expense. Sometimes we think that if someone else has more of the pie, then there is less of the pie for me. Right? So the truth is, it doesn't work that way. Misada hashkafa, because you have your pie, I have my pie. So halavai, you should be zechus to get all of your pie. It doesn't impact me because I'm operating from a different pie. So this yisod of allowing one Jew to enter into a field of another Jew and take a little branch. Again, you can't take from the branch that's producing fruit, and you can't go ahead and take from the part that has the sunlight, and you can't do this. But lamaisa, allowing someone else into your field to take something that belongs to you so that he can begin to build for himself will never negatively impact you. It'll never, that's totally so. That's why we never begrudge the success of the other or the bracha of the other. Because someone else's success, someone else's bracha never ever comes at my expense. Such an incredible yisod. Let's go weiter. Umayan hayotze b'tchila b'nei ha'ir mistakim. And I'm supposed to remember again, next, a new well or a new spring is discovered. So remember again, everyone has the right to go ahead and partake of it. So if you want to say, Amar Rabba Barafuna, v'nosin lo damim. So Rabbi Barafuna said, you're right, everyone could partake of the new spring, but you have to pay the owner. To which the Gemara says, the halacha does not follow this payment. Because remember, again, this goes against everything we were saying. The whole chap of all of this is the ability to go ahead and enjoy someone else's property without paying. I was going to say, just so you understand, what Yeshua was trying to drive home is this interesting idea that on one, so there's a number of things. Number one is the achdus piece, but number two also is the idea of the joint ownership of Eretz Yisrael. As much as Eretz Yisrael is owned by different, right? There are tribal portions, that will say, but every Jew has a portion in every part of Eretz Yisrael. There is no such thing as a part of Eretz Yisrael that is off limits to me. There's no such thing. We all have a joint. So therefore, someone discovers a new well. Okay, I'm going to get a cup of water from that. Right? 1 second, it's in Ruvain's property. I understand it's in Ruvain's property. I'm not allowed to exploit it. Right? I'm not allowed to damage it. I'm not allowed to do anything which in a way adversely impacts Ruvain. But Lamaisa, I'm here to show that this is partly mine as well. Such a beautiful insight. Someone goes weiter. So we'll say, remember, Yoshua, you have to understand something. Yoshua understood part of the beauty of our existence in the desert, and this week's parasha, part of the beauty of our existence in the desert is there was no land ownership. Right? When there was no land ownership and everybody's existing together, that's tremendous achdus. What's the danger? What's the danger in entering into Eretz Yisrael? What's the danger? Everyone retreats to their own corner, right? This is mine and this is yours, and you stay here and I'll stay there. So Yoshua has the unique responsibility of ensuring that everyone could have their tribal portion, but at the same time still maintain a sense of achdus. So how does he do that? Rabbi said that was the point of these enactments. So I could take my animal to any forest, as long as it's a large enough forest, or any well, for that matter, or grab a branch from someone's property. And what all of this does is, even though we all own our own portion, it helps to ferment and cement our achdus. So the Gemara goes weiter. Umachkin v'mishal tiveria u'bilvad shel yifros kela v'yamin esasfina. So we'll say salocha l'maisa. You're allowed to fish on the Kinneret. Everyone is allowed to fish on the Kinneret, but you can't spread out underwater traps which would go ahead and ensnare boats or impede boat traffic. Aval sadru berishtos u'machmaros, but you can't use traps. We'll say nets. You can use nets, but we'll say what they're really referring to over here is like the placement of nets underwater. That's going to be problematic. But again, you want to stand by the shore, with your fishing rod, or you want to cast your net and bring it back in. That's going to be fine. Tanrabanan. Berishona hisnu shvatim zeh shelo yifros kaliya v'yamed esasfina. In the beginning, the shvatim, they agreed with one another that no one should place underwater traps. But you can't use nets. In other words, we'll say the distinction between using a net and underwater nets are left there. That you can't do. Because that impedes boat traffic. But again, to sit there with your fishing rod or to cast the net and to bring it back in, that's fine. Tanrabanan, Yama shel Taveri b'chalko shel Naftali haisa. That's a very beautiful Gemara. Remember again, the Kinneret itself is technically in the tribal portion of Naphtali. First white line of Osai. V'lo old ela shenata malo chaval chayrim. V'lo old. Furthermore, not only did Naphtali really have the entire area of the Kinneret in his tribal portion, Ela shenatal malei chavachem b'droma l'kai mashenehmar yam v'darom yirsha. There was interestingly enough, Naphtali also had, he didn't just have the Kinneret, but he also had the western bank of the Kinneret. Now, what was the point of the southern bank? What was the point of the southern bank? So you will say having a body of water is not enough. What do you need? You need some of the shoreline. Why do you need the shoreline specifically? To be able to bring up your nets, right? So therefore, again, Naphtali had the Kinneret, and he also had additional space on the southern shoreline to be able to bring up his nets. Tanya, Rabbi Shmuel Silber, Telushin Shebaharim. So this is actually an interesting case over here. Telushin Shebaharim. So we'll say, so now let's say again, when Klal Yisrael came into Eretz Yisrael, they conquered the land. And now we'll say, let's say there's property on the land, right? So in this case over here, Telushin Shebaharim, literally detached property that was sitting on the mountains when Klal Yisrael came in. Who gets that? So which the Gemara says, ultimately, again, anything detached in the land, everyone had rights there. And I will say, the interesting novelty in that is, that remember again, they're coming in, obviously the land is already a portion, right? Everyone knows what they're getting. With all of that, even though everyone knows their particular portion, again, if there is detached property, and let's say Ruvain's chelek, everybody has rights to that. Everybody's rights. However, again, it says, but of course, anything attached to the land, that belonged to that particular tribe. Rabbi said, this is interesting. In general, I've always found like the most incredible thing about it, one of the most incredible things about Eretz Yisrael, is the dramatic topographical change within a very limited amount of distance. Right? I always think my favorite drive in Eretz Yisrael is from Yerushalayim to En Gedi, where within literally again 15 minutes, right? Within 15 minutes, you go from city literally to desert, from city and like literal desert, and it's the most breathtaking thing. So the Meir says, interestingly enough, about the topography of Eretz Yisrael, every shevet had mountains, had lowlands, shvela, right? Negev. It's interesting. Negev in this context means like countryside, and Emek, and lowlands or valleys. So every shevet in its tribal area had the complete range of topographical options. Everything you wanted, you had. Shneimar, Penu Su'ulachem, Ubo Hara Mori Ve'al Kol Shchenov, Ba'arava, Bahar, Ubashvela, Ubenegev, Ubechof Hayam. Now it's because we'll say again, the Lashon over here, telling Klal Yisrael to enter into Eretz Yisrael, says, go to Hara Mori and all of its neighbors, and what does everybody have? Everybody has Arava, Har, Shvela, Negev. Now, interesting, not everybody has Chof Hayam, right? Not everyone has waterfront property, right? So that's not like that. But other than that, all the topographical options you pretty much have within every tribal area. V'china tamotzi b'knanim or b'prizim or b'amorav. And above you see this even with the other nations that lived there before Klal Yisrael. Shene'amar v'kol shchinav alma shchinav hachiyavu. All the neighbors had the same thing as well. All the different topographical options. Okay, good. Let's go weiter. V'nifnin lachori hagedar v'afilu b'sadeh shimalei kargo. So this is an interesting one, right? Yoshua said that if you're traveling and you need to relieve yourself, you could go into someone else's field, right? Literally again behind their wall, and defecate, even in a field of karkum, coriander. So what's going on over here? So we'll say, what exactly is the heter? Right? Is the heter is that to relieve yourself? Is that what's happening over here? So we'll say it's not simply defecation, but rather, again, remember, in Talmudic times, they would wipe themselves with stones. So therefore, again, where do you get that stone from? You get it from the wall. So in other words, the heter, I will say, was to go into someone else's field, relieve yourself, and then take one of the stones of their wall to use it for your own hygienic purposes. So the Gemara says as follows. That was the heter. Amr of Chisda, v'afilu b'Shabbos. Right? Rav Chisda said you're even allowed to do this ultimately again on Shabbos. On Shabbos. So Mar Zutra, the Gemara says, Mar Zutra chasida shakel u'mahader. Mar Zutra, when he would do this, he would go into someone's field, relieve himself, defecate, take a stone, wipe himself, but he would always make sure to put the stone back. Thank you. Right? He would go and tell his attendant afterwards, Zil Shake, go and plaster over it. In other words, we'll say, so just to understand, just to see what's happening over here is like this. So there's really two things happening over here. Number one, that you could go into someone's field and relieve yourself. That's number one. Now, that by itself doesn't seem to be such a chiddush. After all, again, could act as fertilizer for the fields, right? Again, I'm not disadvantaging someone like that. The chap really is over here that halacha l'maisa, I'm allowed to use a stone from the wall. That's the idea. I'm allowed to pull out a stone from the wall. Obviously, I'm going to say, I can't crack the wall, but if there's a loose stone in the wall, assuming that it's not going to put the wall at a structural disadvantage, so I'm allowed to go ahead and take the stone and use the stone for my own hygienic needs. That's the chab. That was the takana ultimately again of Yoshua. So Mar Zutra Chasida just kind of went ahead and exhibited an extra level of piety by telling his servant to go ahead and plaster over it, afterwards. But that's the halach of Yoshua. Okay, let's go weiter. Umahalchin b'shvili harushos ad sheteri reviya shniya. We'll say next. You're allowed to go ahead. Now remember, this is talking about next was halacha l'maisa. Ruvain, we'll just use Ruvain as the example, right? So Ruvain went ahead and harvested his field. Now between the harvest and between the next planting, nothing's happening in the field. So during that time, halacha l'maisa, people are permitted to go ahead and walk across my field, or Ruvain's field as a shortcut. So the Gemara says, Amra Papa, the Hy'd done afilu tal kashile. Rabbi Papa says, but our fields, even do is problematic ultimately again for it. Now I will say, what Rav Zutra is pointing out over here is, obviously, this is going to be a field-specific halacha. So we're assuming over here that pedestrian traffic doesn't impact the field. But obviously, again, if pedestrian traffic does have an inverse impact on the field, then obviously you can't do it. So Papa was saying, our fields, even when the dew from the evening time negatively impacts it, alachas kama all the more so pedestrian traffic. Okay, so we'll say, so the idea of it, just to understand the concept bigadol. The concept bigadol is that if there's nothing happening in your field, let people walk across it. But obviously, if pedestrian traffic negatively impacts the field, then people don't have a right to do it. Okay, remember again, this was people are. So remember again, rainy season. There's a bunch of potholes and depressions in the Rosh Hashanah. As a result, if there's potholes, by definition, there's also elevations. So it was often difficult for people to walk in Rosh Hashanah at the beginning of the summer season. So Yeshua gave people the right to walk, on the bordering fields, which is Rosh Hashanah, right, on the sides, so they're able to kind of traverse the edges of private property. So Meir tells a story. Shmuel, Rav Yehuda, Shmuel and Rav Yehuda were walking on the road. So havim mistalik Shmuel etzidi hadrachim. So Shmuel was walking on the sides of the road, right? Because we'll say it was too difficult to walk straight on the Shusarabim. So Shmuel was walking on the sides, which really was the edges of people's fields. Amr Rav Yehuda, Tanayin sheisna Yoshua afilu beBava. So Rav Yehuda said, one more time. Shmuel and Rabbi Yehuda are walking on the road. Ultimately, again, Shmuel decides to go ahead and walk on the sides of the Rosh Hashanah, which is the Rosh Hashanah. So Rabbi Yehuda said, so ultimately, again, so Rabbi Yehuda said to Shmuel, these Tanaim of Yoshua or even in effect in Bava. In other words, Rabbi said, it's actually interesting. Amalei Shani Omer Afilu Bechutz La'aretz. So he says, I even hold that it's a din in Chutz La'aretz. And I will say, no, this is actually very interesting. That it could very well be that although Yoshua legislated these Tanoim, ultimately again to take effect in Eretz Yisrael, it could very well be that they were later extended ultimately for any major Jewish community. Where any place where Jews live in densely populated areas side by side. So Bava, this would take effect. Or maybe even in Chutz La'aretz, in other areas where, again, for the sake of fostering Jewish community, these were necessary, they were applied. Quite interesting. We'll see again the halacha about whether or not that's true. So Rabbi Chia, have a shakli va'azli ba'orcha. Istalku, let's see the hadrachim. So Rabbi and Rabbi Chia were walking on the Rosh Hashanah, right? They were walking on the road. But once again, the Rosh Hashanah was very difficult to pass. So what did they do? They were walking by the edges of the Rosh Hashanah in privately held space. So the Meir says, what happened? So Hava Kamafse va'azar Rabbi Yehuda ben Kenusa Kamayu. Rabbi Yehuda ben Kenusa was in front of them. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Kenusa, what he was doing is, he was like taking long steps over the potholes. So he was choosing not to walk in the sides by private property. Instead, he was kind of like jumping over, like taking long steps over the potholes. Amar Rabbi Chia, mi huzeh shemare gedula b'fanenu. Who is this guy who's acting so arrogantly in front of us? In other words, I will say, what's happening over here is Rabbi and Rabbi Chia, right? There's a takan of Yoshua. What's takan of Yoshua? You don't have to jump over the potholes. You can go ahead and walk on the side of the Rosh Hashanah. They see this person in front of them who's dafka jumping over the potholes. So they felt that it looked like a display of arrogance. So who is this guy who's displaying this arrogant behavior? Rabbi Chia, Shema Rabbi Yehuda ben Kenusa, Talmidihu. Don't get upset. His name is Rabbi Yehuda ben Kenusa. He's my Talmud. V'chol ma'asav l'shem shamayim. And he's a good guy. He's a good guy. He's not trying to look arrogant. Everything that he does for the sake of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Kimatu legabe. When they caught up with him, Chazye, they saw him, Amalei, and ultimately Rebbe said to him, Ilav Yehuda ben Kenusa, if you were not Yehuda ben Kenusa, Gezerah Sinhu, L'shakech begizra de Parzala. Literally, again, we would have hit your legs with an iron club. They're both saying that that's a metaphor, meaning we would have excommunicated you. In other words, they both said this concept, it's actually interesting, this concept, we have this in halacha of like a mechsi ki yehura. When halacha allows you to do something and you don't do it because you're choosing to hold yourself to a higher standard, at times that's good. At times it's good to be machmir with yourself, even if you're allowed to do something, not to do something. And other times it has the appearance of arrogance. So apparently something like this, like Yoshua's enactment, which was so widely held, that people don't jump over potholes. You don't have to do that. You could just walk on the side. And there was a guy who was engaging in this kind of behavior that no one else was engaging in. It had the appearance ultimately of arrogant behavior. So Rabbi Chia said to him, okay, now we know who you are. You're a good guy. You don't mean it to be arrogant. But if you weren't Yehuda ben Kenusia, we would have put you in Chayrim or nidui. We would have excommunicated you in some way. Okay. Hatzah ben Akramim mafsik va'o yored mafsik va'ola. What's the next enactment was someone gets lost in a vineyard. What can you do if you get lost in a vineyard? You could cut down the vines until you make your way out. Now, you have to pay for the damage, but you'll have to do it. So, Tanabanon, Harush Havira Torah ben Akramin was a very beautiful Gemara. If you see your friend lost inside of a vineyard, mafsik va'ola, mafsik v'yoreit, ad shema leo le'ir ola derech. So, now this is a different kind of case. In the case of the Mishnah, in the case of, or I should say, sorry, Yoshua's enactment was, I am lost. I am lost in Reuven's vineyard. I'm allowed to go ahead and cut down the vines until I make it to to the street, right, to the street. This case is a little bit different. In this case, again, I'm fine. I see Reuven lost inside the vineyard. I'm allowed to cut down the vines till I make it to Reuven in order to lead him out to safety. So the Meir says, "V'chein hu shetoah ben akramim mafsik va'ola mafsik v'yored at she'yale le'ir ola derech." So similarly, if I myself am lost, I am allowed to go ahead and cut down the vines until I'm able to make it out of the vineyard. My dechi, what does it mean? And me also if I'm lost. What would you have thought? So I might have thought like this. When am I allowed to cut down vines? Maybe only in case number one. Case number one is where I see my friend Ruvain is lost. So maybe it's only in that case where I'm allowed to cut down the vines. Why? If I know where I am, but I see that Ruvain is lost, I can minimize the damage. Why can I minimize the damage? I know exactly what I have to cut to get to Ruvain. I know exactly what I need to damage or what to cut in order to get out. So that type of premeditated damage for the sake of saving my friend, that I'm allowed to do. Aval hu de lo yoda lehecha kasalik lo nifsag. I would say, but if I'm lost, or I don't know where I'm going, maybe I'm not allowed to damage Ruvain's vineyard. After all, we'll say, there is another alternative. What's the other alternative? Nehader be-mitzri. We'll say, what's the good part about getting lost in a vineyard? The good part is, remember, a vineyard is rows. So really, all you need to do to get yourself out of the vineyard is what? Walk to the end of the row and walk around the perimeter. Some way, somehow, you're going to make it out. Like I said, I might have thought that therefore, if I'm lost, I don't have a license to destroy any vines. Rather, just follow the road to the edge and walk around the perimeter. Kamash malon, no. Kamash malon said that even if I'm lost, I am allowed to go ahead and cut down vines. So two interesting cases over here. Case number one, which is I see that Ruvain is lost. I am allowed to go ahead and cut down vines, get him, and extract him. And the idea over here is that case is a little bit easier to swallow. Why? Because since I know where I am, therefore again I can minimize the amount of damage. Case number two is I'm lost, and I don't know where I am. Halacha l'maisa, I'm permitted to go ahead and cut down the vines until I'm able to see where I am in order to be able to get out of the vineyard. Granted, I have to pay for whatever damage that I do. The Gemara says, Hadda oraisu, but I don't understand. This is not an enactment of Yoshua, right? Ultimately, again, it would seem to be that midarais, I am permitted to go ahead and damage the vines in order to get out. Tisanya, hashavas kufa minayim. We'll say, how do we know that halacha l'maisa hashavas kufa? We'll say that the same way that you have an obligation of hashavas haveda to go ahead and return a person's lost object. That if the person himself is lost, you have an obligation to help him, right? Help restore him to his previous state. TALMUD lomar v'hashivoso. To which the Gemara says, you're right. So we'll say, so therefore, again, if I'm lost in Ruvain's vineyard, then of course, midaraisa, I have the right to cut down the vines in order to get to where I need to get. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Daraisa hu dekai be-mitzri, asahu takim de mafsig va'olim mafsig v'yor. We'll say, not necessarily. Midaraisa. If I'm lost in Ruvain's vineyard, they will say, what should I do? Walk to the end of the row, and ultimately, again, navigate around the perimeter. What Yoshua instituted was, I don't have to walk to the end of the row. Instead, what do? I go ahead and I have the right to cut down vines until I see exactly where I am. So I could cut down the vines to get out, and I could cut down the vines to get to Ruvain, who's lost, and get him as well. So we'll stop over for today. We'll pick up tomorrow, Meir Hashem. There's some beautiful hashkafa embedded in this halacha as well. And Meir Hashem to be continued tomorrow. We'll say, wow, what a beautiful daf. Shkoyach.